Welcome back, dear friends. Before we begin tonight, let me know where in the world you are watching from, and please do not forget to subscribe and like to support the channel. Your presence here means more than you know. Now, settle in somewhere comfortable. Let the day's worries drift away, because tonight we are traveling to a place and time that will stay with you long after you close your eyes. We are going to Tokyo, but not the Tokyo you might imagine. We are going to the Tokyo of 1980, the Tokyo of 1990, and the strange, quiet years that followed. This is a story about what happens when a dream grows so large it swallows everything, and then one morning simply vanishes. There was a single day, December 29th, 1988, when Tokyo stood at the very peak of human wealth and ambition. On that winter afternoon, the Nikkei stock index closed at 38,915. It was the highest point it would reach for the next 34 years. 34 years. An entire generation would be born, grow up and enter adulthood before that number appeared again. But on that cold December day, nobody knew what was coming. The city glittered with confidence. Here is something that will help you understand just how extraordinary that moment was. At the height of the bubble, the grounds of the Imperial Palace in central Tokyo, just 3.4 square kilometers of land, were valued higher than all the real estate in the entire state of California. Think about that for a moment. California, with its beaches and mountains, its cities and farmland, its millions of homes, all of it worth less, on paper, than a single palace garden in Tokyo. But that comparison, as staggering as it sounds, only begins to capture the madness. The total value of Japanese real estate at the peak was estimated at 4 times the value of all American real estate combined. Japan, a nation roughly the size of Montana, was theoretically worth more than the entire United States. Tokyo alone, if you believe the numbers, was worth more than America's total property market. This was not a fever dream. This was the reality that Japanese families, bankers, and businessmen believed would last forever. The story of how Tokyo reached that impossible height and how it fell is not simply an economic tale. It is a story about human nature, about ambition and shame, about what we believe we deserve, and what happens when those beliefs are shattered. It is also, I think, a story about resilience, about how a city and its people found ways to continue, to create, to build new dreams from the ruins of old ones. So let us begin at the beginning, in the years when it seemed like Japan could do no wrong. The transformation began in 1985 at a hotel in New York called The Plaza. Representatives from the world's 5 largest economies met in secret and signed an agreement that would change everything. The Plaza Accord, as it became known, was designed to weaken the American dollar against the Japanese yen. The Americans wanted to make their exports cheaper. What nobody fully anticipated was how profoundly this would reshape Japan. Within 2 years, the yen nearly doubled in strength against the dollar. Japanese companies and citizens who held yen suddenly found their purchasing power exploding. A salary that once felt comfortable now felt wealthy. Savings accounts that seemed modest now contained fortunes. And the Bank of Japan, trying to offset the economic disruption of a stronger currency, lowered interest rates. Borrowing became cheap. Credit flowed like water. What happened next has a kind of intoxicating logic to it. If your money was worth more, why not spend it? If borrowing was cheap, why not invest? If everyone around you was getting rich, why would you be the one to stop? The banks were particularly eager to lend. They had money flowing in from depositors, and interest rates were so low that keeping cash idle made no sense. So they lent to developers, to speculators, to anyone with a plan that involved land. And because land prices only went up, because they had gone up every year for as long as anyone could remember, the loans seemed safe. The collateral was always worth more than what was borrowed against it, until one day, suddenly, it was not. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. In 1987, in 1988, in 1989, there was no reason to worry. There was only reason to celebrate. Tokyo's streets began to change in ways that reflected the new prosperity. In the Ginza district, land prices climbed to 30 million yen per square meter. That works out to more than $20,000 for a single square foot of earth. A parking space in central Tokyo could cost more than a house in most American cities. Businessmen who needed to entertain clients found themselves in hostess clubs where a single bottle of whiskey might cost what an ordinary worker earned in a month, and still the expense accounts kept growing. The hostess club industry deserves its own examination because it revealed something essential about the bubble economy. These were establishments where men, usually businessmen on expense accounts, would pay extraordinary sums to drink with attractive women who would pour their drinks, light their cigarettes, and listen to their conversation. Nothing more than that, at least officially. But the prices were astronomical. At the peak, companies were spending more on business entertainment than the Japanese government spent on national defense. Think about what that means. A nation was spending more on whiskey and conversation than on its own military. The expense was justified as relationship building, as the lubricant of commerce. And in a culture where business was conducted through personal connections rather than contracts, there was some truth to this. But there was also madness. The art world provides perhaps the clearest window into the excess of those years. In 1987, an insurance company called Yasuda Fire and Marine paid nearly $40 million for a single painting. It was Van Gogh's Sunflowers, and the price was a world record. But that record would not last long. 3 years later, a paper company chairman named Ryo Saito walked into Christie's auction house and paid $82.5 million for Van Gogh's portrait of Dr. Gachet. He added a Renoir for another $78 million. In a single evening, one Japanese businessman spent more than $160 million on 2 paintings. Japanese buyers were acquiring nearly half of all Impressionist art on the global market. Museums and collectors around the world watched with a mixture of awe and alarm as masterpieces disappeared into Japanese corporate collections, sometimes to be displayed in bank lobbies or insurance company headquarters. There is a detail about Saito that tells you everything about the era. He reportedly said that when he died, he wanted the Van Gogh and the Renoir cremated with him. The paintings were too beautiful, he felt, to be seen by anyone else. The international art world was horrified. Saito later said he was joking. Perhaps he was. But in an era of such excess, who could be certain? The spending extended far beyond art. Golf club memberships sold for nearly $4 million at exclusive courses like Kobané Country Club. The membership itself was tradable like a stock, and speculators bought and sold them expecting prices to keep rising. More than 160 new golf courses were built between 1989 and 1991, with another 1,200 under construction. Japan, a mountainous island nation with limited flat land, was being reshaped to accommodate the leisure activities of the newly wealthy. Former Prime Minister Kiichi Miyazawa owned a tiny property, 1/6 of an acre, that was valued at nearly 3 billion yen. He used it as collateral to borrow over 13 billion yen from 7 different banks. The banks were delighted to lend. After all, land prices only went up. The theme park industry captures the optimism and ambition of those years. Developers broke ground on dozens of massive entertainment complexes, each one more elaborate than the last. They built replicas of European villages, indoor ski resorts in tropical climates, water parks that could accommodate tens of thousands of visitors. The plans assumed that prosperity would continue forever, that Japanese families would have endless money and time for leisure. Many of these parks would never open. Others would open and quickly close, monuments to miscalculation. But in 1988 and 1989, the blueprints seemed reasonable. Everything seemed reasonable. The stories that emerged from those years sound almost fictional. Businessmen flagging down taxis by waving bundles of 10,000 yen notes, the equivalent of about $75 each. In the rain, when taxis were scarce, men would hold up multiple notes, competing with each other for the driver's attention. Companies paying job candidates 30 to 50,000 yen just to attend an interview. The hiring market was so competitive that companies would do anything to attract talent. At corporate parties, executives would light cigars with 10,000 yen notes. The gesture was meant to demonstrate success, to show that money meant nothing because there was so much of it. Young employees watched and learned that this was what prosperity looked like. And then came the acquisitions that captured the world's attention. In September 1989, Sony purchased Columbia Pictures for $4.9 billion. American commentators were stunned. A Japanese electronics company now owned some of the most iconic films in Hollywood history. A month later, Mitsubishi bought a controlling stake in Rockefeller Center for $846 million. The symbolism was not lost on anyone. The very buildings that represented American capitalism, the Christmas tree that appeared on television each December, were now owned by Japanese companies. American magazines ran covers showing the Statue of Liberty in a kimono. Politicians warned of a Japanese takeover. Books with titles like The Coming War with Japan became bestsellers. The fear was real, even if it was misplaced. Japan was not conquering America. Japan was simply spending money it believed it had. If you walked through Tokyo in those final months of 1980, you would have felt something in the air, a kind of certainty. Not arrogance exactly, but the deep belief that the future belonged to Japan. The trains ran on time. The streets were clean. The economy was a machine that only moved in one direction. Up. The Nippon Telegraph and Telephone privatization of 1987 illustrated the national mood. When NTT shares were offered to the public, they were 6 times oversubscribed. The stock price doubled within a month. NTT's market capitalization reached $376 billion, making it worth more than the entire stock markets of Germany and Hong Kong combined. A single company worth more than entire nations. By 1989, Japanese stocks represented 42% of global equity market capitalization. 8 of the world's 10 largest companies by market value were Japanese. Only ExxonMobil in 6th place broke the monopoly. The Japanese stock market was not merely large, it was dominant in a way that no single national market had ever been before. And then Christmas came. On December 25, 1989, a new governor took control of the Bank of Japan. His name was Yasushi Meno, and he had been watching the bubble grow with mounting concern. On that same day, he raised interest rates. It was a small increase, from 3.75 to 4.25%, but it was a signal. Meno believed the bubble was dangerous. He believed it needed to be deflated before it caused even greater damage. 4 days later, the Nikkei hit its peak. And then, so quietly that almost no one noticed at first, it began to fall. The Bank of Japan continued tightening. Rates rose again in March and again in August, eventually reaching 6%. Each increase was intended to cool the speculation. Instead, each increase pushed the economy closer to collapse. The crash did not happen all at once. That is an important thing to understand. There was no single catastrophic day like America's Black Monday. Instead, there was a slow, terrible unwinding. In January, the Nikkei was still above 38,000. By March, it had fallen below 30,000. By October, it was under 22,000. By the end of 1990, the Japanese stock market had lost more than 40% of its value. 40%. Imagine watching nearly half of everything you thought you owned simply disappear. Imagine logging into your brokerage account, or in those days, calling your broker and learning that your retirement fund, your children's education savings, your dreams of a comfortable future were worth less than they had been the day before. and the day before that, and the day before that. But here is the strange thing. Life continued. The trains still ran on time. The convenience stores still sold their rice balls and hot canned coffee. Salarymen still put on their suits each morning and commuted to offices where they pretended that nothing had changed, because admitting that something had changed meant admitting that they had been wrong. And in Japanese culture, being wrong carried a weight that those from other societies often struggle to understand. Real estate prices began their descent too. Tokyo commercial land dropped more than 15% in 1991. Residential property fell even faster. But unlike stocks, which could be sold in a moment of panic, real estate moved slowly. Families who had bought homes at the peak found themselves trapped. They owed more on their mortgages than their homes were worth. In America, they call this being underwater. In Japan, it became a way of life that would last for decades. Consider the mathematics. A young family purchases a small apartment in 1988 for 70 million yen, about $500,000 at the time. They put down 20% and borrow the rest over 35 years. By 1995, that apartment is worth perhaps 30 million yen. They owe more than 50 million on their mortgage, but their home is worth barely half of that. They cannot sell without coming up with tens of millions of yen to pay the difference. They cannot refinance because no bank will lend against such depreciated collateral. They are trapped, making payments on a debt that exceeds the value of what they bought, and yet they continued paying. Month after month, year after year, because that was what responsible people did. Because walking away from a debt was shameful in a way that financial loss was not. The banks knew, even in those early years, that something was terribly wrong. Their loan portfolios were filled with properties that would never recover their value, companies that would never repay their debts. But admitting this would mean admitting failure. So they did something that seemed logical at the time. They pretended. The Japanese had a term for the companies that should have died but were kept alive by banks unwilling to acknowledge their losses. They called them zombie companies, corporations that consumed resources, employed workers, produced goods, but existed in a kind of living death. The banks fed them just enough credit to keep going, because allowing them to fail would mean writing off the loans, and writing off the loans would mean admitting the truth. This strategy of denial worked for a while, or rather, it appeared to work. The unemployment rate stayed low, the shops stayed open, but beneath the surface, something was rotting. Capital that should have flowed to productive new enterprises was instead being used to prop up failures. Young companies that might have grown and innovated could not get loans because the bank's balance sheets were clogged with bad debt. The economy was being slowly strangled by its refusal to face reality. Meanwhile, land prices continued their long descent. By the mid-90s, commercial real estate in Tokyo had fallen by more than 60% from its peak. Prime properties in Ginza that had sold for 30 million yen per square meter were now worth a fraction of that. The golf course memberships that had traded for $4 million could not find buyers at any price. The theme parks that had broken ground during the boom years faced a reckoning. Some projects were abandoned mid-construction, their half-finished structures standing as monuments to hubris. Others opened to empty crowds and quickly closed. The indoor ski resort, the European village, the water park designed for visitors who would never come. Japan was littered with the dreams of 1980. It took 7 years for the rot to become undeniable. In November 1997, the system that had been held together by collective denial finally began to collapse. On November 3rd, a securities firm called Sanyo became the first Japanese brokerage to fail since World War II. The interbank lending market froze. Banks suddenly realized they could not trust each other. If Sanyo had hidden losses, who else was hiding losses? The foundation of mutual confidence that held the financial system together began to crack. 2 weeks later, on November 17th, Hokkaido Takushoku Bank announced it was closing. It was the first major city bank to fail in the post-war era. For decades, Japanese banks had been considered unshakable. The government would never let them fail. Depositors would always be protected. And now a bank was closing, and the certainties of a generation were revealed as illusions. And then, just a week after that, came the moment that would define the era. Yamaichi Securities was one of Japan's 4 great brokerage firms. It had been founded nearly a century earlier in 1897. It employed 7,500 people. It had survived world wars, occupations, recessions. It was supposed to be permanent, like Mount Fuji, like the Imperial Palace, like Japan itself. On November 24, 1997, its president, a man named Shohei Nozawa, stood before television cameras and announced that the company was closing forever. What happened next became one of the most famous images in Japanese business history. Nozawa bowed deeply, as is customary when delivering grave news, and then his face crumpled. Tears began streaming down his cheeks. His voice broke. "It breaks my heart," he said, "that the situation has turned out like this." He apologized to the employees. He apologized to the customers. He took responsibility even though investigations would later reveal that only 3 people in the entire company had known about the illegal schemes that hid 260 billion yen in losses. The practice was called tabashi, which means to fly away. When clients suffered losses on their investments, Yamaichi would secretly transfer those losses to shell companies, making them disappear from official records. The clients were happy because their statements showed profits. The executives were happy because the company appeared healthy. But the losses did not actually disappear. They accumulated year after year, until there were 260 billion yen in hidden obligations, and the game could not continue. Those 7,500 employees learned that morning that their careers were over. Some of them had worked at Yamaichi for decades. They had given their lives to the company, as Japanese workers were expected to do. They had sacrificed evenings with their families, weekends with their children, years of their lives. And now they had nothing. Not just unemployment, but the shame of being associated with a company that had failed, that had cheated, that had brought disgrace upon itself and everyone connected to it. The Long-Term Credit Bank of Japan, one of the nation's most prestigious financial institutions, was nationalized in 1998. The Nippon Credit Bank followed shortly after. By the time the cleanup was complete, 181 Japanese banks had failed. The government had spent 38 trillion yen trying to stabilize the financial system. And an entire generation had learned that the promises of lifetime employment and steady advancement were lies. The employment ice age, as it came to be called, began around 1994 and lasted for a decade. Young people graduating from university found themselves entering a frozen job market. The positions that had once been guaranteed no longer existed. Companies that had once competed for talent now barely responded to applications. To understand what this meant, you need to understand how Japanese employment had worked for the previous 40 years. When you graduated from a good university, you did not simply get a job. You joined a company. You became part of a corporate family that would care for you for the rest of your working life. Your salary would rise steadily, not based on performance but on seniority. You would be trained, mentored, promoted. When you retired, you would receive a generous pension. The company would even help arrange your marriage, introducing you to suitable candidates from other corporate families. This system had been the foundation of Japanese society. It explained why people worked such long hours, why they sacrificed so much for their employers, why company loyalty was valued above almost everything else. You gave everything to the company because the company gave everything back. And then suddenly the company stopped hiring. The new graduates of 1994, 1995, 1996 found themselves facing closed doors. They had done everything right. They had studied hard, passed their exams, earned their degrees from respectable universities. They had followed the path that every authority figure in their lives had told them to follow. And at the end of that path, there was nothing. An estimated 17 to 20 million people came of age during those years. They are now in their 40s and 50s, and many of them never recovered. They became what the Japanese call freeters, a word combining the English free with the German word for worker. In the bubble era, being a freeter had meant choosing freedom over corporate conformity. It was almost romantic. Young artists and musicians who rejected the salaryman life, who preferred flexibility to security. But after the crash, freeter simply meant failure. It meant you could not get a real job, so you worked at convenience stores and fast food restaurants and construction sites. It meant you pieced together part-time shifts that never added up to a living wage. It meant you lived with your parents into your 30s because you could not afford rent. It meant you did not marry, did not have children, did not accumulate the savings that would allow you to retire with dignity. By 2001, more than 4 million Japanese were classified as freeters. 2/3 of them had never held a regular, full-time job. Their average monthly income was 139,000 yen, about $1,300. Not enough to marry, to have children, to buy a home, not enough to build a life. The women of this generation faced particular challenges. In traditional Japanese corporate culture, women were expected to work for a few years after graduation, then leave to marry and raise children. Companies called them office flowers, decorative presences who would eventually be replaced. But if a woman could not find a husband because young men could not afford to marry, and could not find a stable job because companies were not hiring, where exactly was she supposed to go? Many women of the Ice Age generation remained unmarried, some by choice certainly, but many because the economics simply did not work. Japan's birth rate, already declining, fell further. The population began to age in ways that would reshape the nation for decades to come. The shame of financial failure in Japan carried consequences that those from other cultures sometimes struggle to comprehend. Debt was not merely an economic problem. It was a moral stain. To owe money and be unable to pay it back was to fail not just yourself, but your family, your ancestors, the entire social order that had given you your place in the world. There is a phrase in Japanese, sekinin, which is usually translated as responsibility, but it means something deeper than the English word. It carries connotations of duty, of obligation, of the weight that comes from being connected to others. When you failed, your sekinin failed too. Your shame spread to everyone connected to you. Between 1997 and 1998, Japan's suicide rate jumped by nearly 35%. More than 32,000 people took their own lives in 1998. Among those who left notes, 9 people every day cited economic factors as their reason. 9 people every single day who decided that the shame of debt was worse than death. The rate peaked in 2003 at over 34,000 deaths. For comparison, Japan's population was about 127 million at the time. The suicide rate reached 27 per 100,000, among the highest in the developed world. Men were particularly vulnerable. A man who lost his job, who could not provide for his family, who had failed in his fundamental duty as a husband and father, might see only one way to redeem himself. One debt counselor observed something that has stayed with me. Japanese people, he said, feel it is an obligation to pay back money they have borrowed. They are determined to pay it back even if it kills them. And for many, it did. Life insurance policies in Japan often paid out even in cases of suicide, as long as the policy had been in force for more than a year. A man who had borrowed money to start a business, or to buy a home, or to invest in stocks that were now worthless, could make his family whole by killing himself. The insurance money would pay the debts. His children would not inherit his shame. There is something almost unbearable about this logic. The idea that a father might calculate the value of his death might decide that he was worth more gone than present, might say goodbye to his children knowing that his absence would provide for them in ways his presence could not. And yet it happened thousands of times. But there was another way out, one that has no equivalent in most other cultures. The Japanese called it johatsu, which means evaporation. To commit johatsu was to disappear completely from your own life, to abandon your home, your family, your debts, and vanish as if you had never existed. Businesses emerged to help people evaporate. They called themselves yoniji, which translates roughly to moving company for nighttime escapes. For a fee, they would arrive at your apartment in the middle of the night, pack your belongings, and help you relocate to a city where no one knew your name. They would cancel your utilities, forward your mail, erase the traces of your existence. You would become a ghost, alive but no longer present in the world you had known. Some estimates suggest that 100,000 Japanese evaporate every year. They leave behind confused families, unpaid debts, unanswered questions. They trade their identities for anonymity, their histories for fresh starts. A father might disappear because he cannot face his children after losing their college funds. A businessman might vanish because he cannot endure the shame of bankruptcy. A wife might evaporate because she cannot bear one more day of a marriage that has become unbearable. Sanya, a neighborhood in eastern Tokyo, became known as a gathering place for the evaporated. It was a district of cheap flop houses and day labor offices where men could find work loading trucks or cleaning construction sites without providing identification. No one asked where you came from. No one asked your real name. You were simply a body that could work, and that was enough. Whether johatsu is tragedy or mercy, I am not certain. Perhaps it is both. The people who vanished escaped their debts, their shame, their impossible situations. But they also lost everything that had given their lives meaning. Their children grew up without fathers. Their parents aged without sons. The evaporated were alive but not living, present but absent, saved but lost. The economic suffering did not exist in isolation. Beneath the legitimate businesses and the respectable banks, darker forces had been profiting from the bubble all along. The Yakuza, Japan's organized crime syndicates, had found the bubble era remarkably profitable. Their specialty was something called jiajeya, which means land shark. When developers wanted to build on land occupied by small businesses or residences, they turned to the Yakuza to clear the way. The methods were not subtle. Threats, harassment, flooding homes with poisonous centipedes, sometimes arson. In a city where land was worth millions of dollars per square meter, convincing a stubborn shopkeeper to sell could be worth enormous fees. The Yakuza were efficient. They knew how to apply pressure. They knew how to make life unbearable for those who refused reasonable offers. By 1990, Osaka police had documented more than 1,600 jiageya cases, but they could do little. The connections between organized crime, legitimate business, and political power were too entangled to untangle. When the bubble burst, investigators discovered that perhaps 10% of Japanese banks' bad loans were directly connected to Yakuza organizations. Another 30% had suspected connections. Total Yakuza-linked debt reached an estimated $1 trillion. Some economists began calling Japan's troubles the Yakuza recession, arguing that organized crime had distorted lending decisions so badly that the entire financial system was compromised. The political system was also rotting from within. The recruit scandal, which broke in 1988 and continued into 1989, implicated more than 160 government and business figures. The scheme was elegant in its corruption. A company founder named Hiromasa Ezo had distributed shares in his company before it went public, when they were worth relatively little. When the company's stock price exploded after the IPO, everyone who had received shares became suddenly wealthy. Among those who had received these gifts were 2 former prime ministers, the sitting finance minister, and dozens of members of the Diet. Prime Minister Takeshita's approval ratings collapsed from 50% to below 20%. He was forced to resign. The Liberal Democratic Party, which had ruled Japan continuously since 1955, lost power for the first time. The scandal revealed something that many Japanese had suspected but preferred not to discuss. The system that had produced the economic miracle was not clean. It was built on relationships that blurred the line between legitimate business and corruption, between public service and private enrichment. The bubble had hidden these problems because everyone was getting rich. When the bubble burst, there was nowhere left to hide. And then there was the cult. On the morning of March 20th, 1995, 5 members of a religious group called Shinrikyo boarded trains on 3 different Tokyo subway lines. They carried bags containing a liquid form of sarin, a nerve agent so deadly that a single drop on the skin can kill. At coordinated moments during the rush hour commute, they punctured the bags and left the trains. 13 people died that morning. Nearly 6,000 were injured. The images of commuters collapsing on platforms, of emergency workers in hazmat suits, of a city suddenly gripped by terror, shocked the world. Tokyo, the safest major city on Earth, had been attacked with a weapon of mass destruction. What made the attack even more disturbing was the profile of Aeon's members. They were not marginalized outcasts. They were graduates of Japan's most elite universities, scientists, doctors, engineers. People who should have had brilliant futures. They had been drawn to the cult during the years when everything seemed to be changing, when the certainties of bubble-era prosperity were giving way to something more uncertain. The cult offered meaning, purpose, answers. It offered belonging in an era when traditional paths were closing. Shoko Asahara, the cult's leader, had apocalyptic visions that resonated with followers who sensed that the world they had known was ending, and in a sense it was, not through divine intervention but through economic collapse. The subway attack was a symptom of a society under stress, of young people searching for meaning in a world that no longer made sense. The attack forced Japan to confront questions that went beyond any single group of terrorists. What had gone wrong in a society that produced such people? What were the children of prosperity searching for? Why had material success failed to provide spiritual peace? These questions hung in the air throughout the lost decade, never fully answered. But life in Tokyo during those years was not only darkness and disaster. If you walked the streets in the mid-1990s, you would have seen something remarkable happening alongside the economic suffering. Ordinary life continued, and in its continuation revealed unexpected beauty. Before smartphones, before the internet became ubiquitous, Japanese teenagers communicated through devices called pokeberu, pocket bells or pagers. By 1996, more than 10 million people subscribed to pager services. The devices could not transmit voice, only numbers, so the teenagers invented a language. They would line up at phone booths, punching in numeric codes that spelled out messages. 14106 meant, I love you. 083 meant good night. 0906 meant, will you go out with me? 4649 meant nice to meet you. The codes were based on Japanese wordplay, the numbers sounding like syllables when spoken aloud. It was a secret language, incomprehensible to parents, belonging entirely to the young. Girls called their pager contacts beru-tomo, bell friends. Sometimes these were friends from school. Sometimes they were strangers. People you had never met face to face but knew only through the blinking numbers on a small screen. There was something innocent and strange about these relationships, conducted entirely in code, entirely in imagination. The first generation of mobile phones appeared in Japan in 1985, but they were enormous, weighing 3 kilograms and requiring a shoulder bag to carry. By the late 1990s, the phones had shrunk to handheld size, and Japanese technology was racing ahead of the rest of the world. In 1990, NTT Docomo launched iMode, the first mobile internet platform. Japanese teenagers were sending emails and browsing websites on their phones years before the iPhone would make such things commonplace elsewhere. They called it the Galapagos effect. Japanese mobile technology evolved in isolation, developing features that the rest of the world would not see for a decade. Camera phones, mobile payments, QR codes, emoji. All of these originated in 1990s Japan, in a society that was supposedly stagnant, supposedly lost, supposedly unable to innovate. The convenience store, or konbini, had become essential infrastructure. By 1992, there were approximately 20,000 convenience stores across Japan, and that number was still growing even as the bubble collapsed. These small shops, open 24 hours a day, offered something that went far beyond their modest size. You could buy rice balls wrapped in perfect sheets of seaweed, the tuna mayonnaise variety being a particular national treasure. The packaging was ingeniously designed so that the seaweed stayed crisp until the moment you unwrapped it. You could buy hot canned coffee from a heated display case, or cold green tea in the summer. You could pay your electricity bill at the counter, or your rent, or your insurance premiums. You could send a package to your grandmother in Osaka and track its delivery online. You could use the copy machine, the ATM, the ticket printer. You could buy concert tickets, train reservations, theme park admissions. You could find a surprisingly good cup of freshly brewed coffee and a warm pork bun at 3 in the morning when sleep would not come and the apartment felt too small. In a society where homes were often cramped and walls thin, the konbini became a kind of public living room, a place of light and warmth in a city that could feel cold despite its millions of people. The staff would greet you with irashimasu, welcome, and thank you with arigato gozaimashita, and in these small courtesies the lonely hours became more bearable. The trains, too, had their own strange poetry. More than 3 million people commuted into Tokyo each day from the surrounding prefectures. Even with trains arriving every 2 or 3 minutes during rush hour, the carriages ran at more than 200% of their intended capacity. There were professional pushers sometimes recruited from the ranks of unemployed sumo wrestlers whose job was to compress passengers into the cars so the doors could close. A photographer named Michael Wolff captured these commutes in a series called Tokyo Compression. His images show faces pressed against windows, bodies squeezed so tightly together that breathing becomes difficult, eyes closed in something between endurance and meditation. The photographs are disturbing, but also strangely beautiful. There is a kind of surrender in those faces, an acceptance of circumstances beyond individual control. And yet people return to these trains every morning and every evening. They found ways to read, holding paperback novels in one hand above the crush of bodies. They learned to sleep standing up, bodies swaying with the motion of the train, waking automatically at their station. They existed in intimate proximity with strangers they would never speak to. There was a kind of community in the shared ordeal. Groping on crowded trains became such a problem that railways introduced women-only cars during rush hour. The cars were marked with pink signs, and men who entered faced social shame and sometimes arrest. It was an imperfect solution to a systemic problem, but it provided some measure of safety in the daily crush. At home, in apartments that often measured no more than 20 or 30 square meters, families found ways to live. The futons came out at night and folded away each morning. The kotatsu table with its built-in heater and heavy blanket became the gathering point for winter evenings. Families would sit with their legs under the table, the blanket trapping warmth, eating Mikan oranges and watching television together. The rice cooker was programmed to have breakfast ready at 6. The washing machine ran loads that would be hung on the balcony to dry. The bathtub was filled each evening, and family members would wash outside the tub before soaking in the same hot water, one after another. These small rituals of comfort in small spaces repeated each day created a rhythm of life that persisted through economic turmoil. And in the evenings, after the long commute and the demanding work, there were the izakayas. These informal pubs with their paper lanterns and sliding doors, their small dishes of grilled chicken and pickled vegetables, offered something that the corporate world could not: relaxation, honesty. The chance to admit exhaustion to colleagues who were equally exhausted. The custom of nomikai, drinking parties with co-workers, was deeply embedded in Japanese business culture, but it served a purpose beyond mere socializing. In the hierarchical world of the Japanese office, there were things that could not be said directly. Criticism of superiors, disagreement with policies, frustration with decisions. These things were dangerous to express. But after a few drinks, in the informal atmosphere of the izakaya, the rules loosened. People spoke more freely. Tensions were released. Relationships were deepened. Perhaps it was in these small moments that Tokyo's true resilience lived, not in the grand recovery plans of government ministries or the restructuring efforts of corporate boardrooms, but in the daily choice to continue, to wait for the train, to eat the rice ball, to drink the beer with co-workers and speak freely for an hour before returning to the formal hierarchies of daytime. The karaoke box also provided refuge. Small private rooms where groups of friends or colleagues could sing without embarrassment. The song catalogues were vast, ranging from classic enka ballads to the latest pop hits. A salaryman who had spent the day bowing to superiors could spend the evening belting out rock songs, microphone in hand, briefly free from the constraints of his role. Pachinko parlors lined the streets of every neighborhood, their interiors bright and deafening. The small steel balls cascaded through the machines in a constant roar of sound. Players sat hypnotized, feeding balls into the machines, hoping for the jackpot that would allow them to exchange their winnings for prizes, and those prizes for cash at nearby shops. The industry was worth billions, and much of it was connected to organized crime. But for the players, it was simply an escape. A place where the chaos of the machines drowned out the chaos of the world. But there was another kind of response to the lost decade, one that came from the young people who had never known the bubble's promises and therefore felt no obligation to its failures. And this response looked like rebellion. In the Shibuya district, beginning around 1992 and 1993, a new kind of girl began appearing on the streets. She had bleached hair, often in shades of orange or blonde, that would have scandalized her grandmother. Her school uniform was modified, the skirt shortened dramatically, the socks deliberately loose and bunched around the ankles. Her makeup was bold, her accessories excessive, her attitude unmistakably defiant. They called them Gyaru, adapted from the English word gal, and they represented something genuinely new. For generations, the Japanese ideal of feminine beauty had emphasized pale skin, black hair, modesty, refinement. The Gyaru rejected all of it. They tanned their skin deliberately, sometimes to extreme degrees, in a sub-style called ganguro, which literally means blackface. They dyed their hair in possible colors. They decorated their faces with white makeup around the eyes, creating looks that seemed designed to shock. The department store Shibuya 109 became their temple. Its cylindrical tower dominated the intersection outside Shibuya Station, and its floors were filled with small boutiques selling the clothes and accessories that Gyaru culture demanded. Platform boots, tiny skirts, layers of jewelry, stickers, and decorations for mobile phones. The brands changed constantly, each one briefly essential before being replaced by the next trend. The singer Naomi Amuro became their icon. She was Okinawan, with features that did not fit the traditional Japanese beauty standard. She wore platform boots and miniskirts. She danced. She seemed to care nothing for the approval of older generations. When she announced her pregnancy at age 20, unmarried, it scandalized conservative Japan. But to her fans, it only added to her appeal. But here is what I think is important to understand about the Gyaru. They were not merely being rebellious for its own sake. They were creating an identity in a time when the identities their parents had expected for them no longer made sense. The path of study hard, join a good company, marry well, raise children, support your husband's career, this path had shattered along with the economy. If that path was closed, why not walk a different one? The Gyaru claimed ownership of their own bodies. They chose how to present themselves to the world, and they chose deliberately outrageous presentations. In a culture of conformity, they insisted on standing out. In a culture of modesty, they insisted on display. They were criticized, mocked, warned that they would never find husbands or jobs. Perhaps they would not. But they had created something new, and it belonged to them. In nearby Harajuku, the collapse of the bubble brought unexpected gifts. As property values fell and businesses failed, rents dropped. Spaces that had been too expensive for young entrepreneurs suddenly became affordable. And into those spaces flowed a generation of designers, artists, and dreamers. Gothic Lolita fashion, with its Victorian-inspired dresses and dark aesthetic, emerged from the streets of Harajuku. Young women dressed as living dolls in elaborate gowns with petticoats and parasols, their faces made up like porcelain. Decorous style covered the body with hundreds of colorful accessories until the person beneath became almost invisible under the weight of plastic jewelry and plush toys. Visual K-bands combined music and fashion into theatrical performances of gender-bending intensity. None of this could have happened in quite the same way during the bubble years, when every square meter of Harajuku real estate was precious beyond reason. The crisis created room. And the young people of Tokyo filled that room with creativity that would eventually reshape how the world saw Japan. This brings us to one of the most remarkable contradictions of the lost decade. As the economy stagnated, as banks failed, as families struggled, Japan's creative industries exploded onto the global stage. Consider what happened in the Akihabara district. For decades, this neighborhood had been known primarily for electronics. It was where you went to buy radios, televisions, the latest gadgets. Tiny shops crammed into narrow buildings, their shelves overflowing with components and devices. But in the mid-90s, something shifted. Personal computers were displacing consumer electronics, and the people buying those computers had different interests than the previous generation. In 1995, an anime series called Neon Genesis Evangelion premiered on Japanese television. It was dark, psychologically complex, and unlike anything that had come before. The story followed teenagers forced to pilot giant robots against mysterious enemies, but beneath the action lay a meditation on depression, alienation, and the search for human connection. Anime historians credit it with revitalizing an entire industry during a period of creative stagnation, and its fans began gathering in Akihabara, looking for merchandise, for connection, for community. The district transformed. Electronics shops gave way to stores selling anime figures, manga, video games. The first maid cafes, where waitresses dressed as servants and addressed customers as master, appeared in 1998. The concept was strange, even by Tokyo standards, but it found an audience among young men who felt disconnected from traditional social roles. By the early 2000s, Akihabara had become the global capital of otaku culture, a word that once meant obsessive fan and had been used as an insult, but was now being reclaimed with pride. The Akihabara department store, which had opened in 1951 selling household goods to post-war families, closed on December 31, 2006. It was the end of one era and the confirmation of another. The video game industry tells a similar story of creative explosion during economic hardship. On December 3, 1994, Sony launched the PlayStation. It would become the first gaming console to sell 100 million units worldwide. The games that emerged from Japan during the lost decade became landmarks of the medium. Final Fantasy VII, released in 1997, has been called one of the most influential games of all time. Its epic story of resistance against a corrupt corporation resonated with players around the world, and its fusion of cinematic storytelling with interactive gameplay changed expectations for what games could be. Reviewers compared its cultural impact to Star Wars. Resident Evil created the survival horror genre. Metal Gear Solid explored themes of nuclear proliferation and the nature of identity. Silent Hill used psychological terror to explore guilt and grief. Japanese developers were not simply making games. They were creating art that spoke to the anxieties of the age. By 2002, the Japanese video game industry represented approximately half of the entire global market. This was not despite the economic crisis. It was, in some ways, because of it. When traditional paths to success close, creative paths open. When corporations stop hiring, talented young people find other outlets for their abilities. Fashion designers like Rei Kawakubo, Yohji Yamamoto, and Issei Miyake had been working for years, but the 90s saw Japanese fashion achieve unprecedented international influence. Their designs rejected the excess of the bubble era in favor of something more austere, more intellectual, more strange. Black became the dominant color. Asymmetry replaced symmetry. Clothing became sculpture. The economic crisis forced a kind of innovation, a rejection of the excessive displays of the bubble era in favor of something more thoughtful. If you could not afford luxury, you could afford vision. If the mainstream economy had failed you, you could create your own economy on the margins. And anime continued to produce masterworks. Ghost in the Shell in 1995, exploring consciousness and identity in a world of cyborgs and networks. Cowboy Bebop in 1998, blending jazz, science fiction, and film noir into something entirely new. Pokémon beginning its global conquest in 1997, creating a franchise that would become one of the most valuable in entertainment history. By 1996, Japan's cultural exports exceeded both its industrial exports and its cultural imports combined. The country was no longer just making cars and electronics, it was making dreams. There is something profound in this. When the conventional economy failed, the creative economy flourished. When the paths to corporate success closed, paths to artistic success opened. When Japan could no longer be the world's factory, it became the world's imagination. By 2006, the Japanese foreign minister publicly described himself as an otaku. A term that had once been shameful was now spoken with something like pride. The margins had become the mainstream. The outsiders had inherited the culture. As the years passed, Tokyo's neighborhoods found their own ways to heal and transform. Ginza, which had once represented the absolute peak of bubble-era excess, reinvented itself gradually. The hostess clubs that had thrived on unlimited expense accounts faded as corporate entertainment budgets were slashed. The water tower building, constructed at the peak specifically to house hostess establishments, opened with most of its floors vacant. But in 1997, community leaders established what they called the Ginza Rules, a set of principles for neighborhood development that emphasized elegance over mere expense. International luxury brands began moving in, drawn by Ginza's prestige and the suddenly affordable rents. Louis Vuitton, Chanel, Gucci, they opened flagship stores in buildings that had once housed brokerages and banks. The district became known less for wild excess and more for refined taste. The change was neither simple nor complete, but it was real. Roppongi's trajectory was darker before it found light. Giuliana's Tokyo, the iconic disco that had represented the final gasp of bubble-era glamour, opened in 1991 and closed in 1994. The women who had danced on elevated platforms in revealing outfits became symbols of an era that was already becoming history. Many clubs followed Giuliana's into closure as the money dried up. For years, Roppongi developed a reputation as perhaps Tokyo's most dangerous district. Drug dealing, prostitution, predatory bars that drugged tourists and charged them thousands of dollars for drinks they never ordered. Nigerian and other foreign touts lined the streets, steering visitors toward establishments that existed to separate them from their money. The bright lights masked something that had gone badly wrong. But renovation came eventually. Roppongi Hills opened in 2003, a massive mixed-use development that tried to reimagine what the neighborhood could be. Offices, apartments, shops, museums, hotels, all integrated into a single vertical community. Tokyo Midtown followed in 2006. The developers bet that Roppongi's central location and international associations could be turned from liability to asset. And interestingly, Maharaja Roppongi, a club from the bubble era, reopened to crowds that included both nostalgic survivors of those years and young people curious about what they had missed. The bubble had become history, and history had become entertainment. Kabukicho in Shinjuku had always been complicated. Named in 1948 for a kabuki theater that was planned but never built, it had evolved into Tokyo's largest entertainment district. Host clubs, hostess clubs, love hotels, karaoke bars, restaurants, pachinko parlors, and establishments of every variety crowded its narrow streets. During the bubble years, organized crime had tightened its grip on the district. The host club industry, where handsome young men entertained wealthy women, grew enormous. These were mirror images of hostess clubs, with young men pouring champagne, lighting cigarettes, and providing flattering attention to women who paid for the privilege. One pioneer reported annual revenues of 2.7 billion yen at the industry's peak. By 2002, an estimated 70% of the land in Kabukicho was owned by foreign-born Japanese residents, many with complex relationships to various power structures. The district had become a law unto itself, a place where the rules that governed the rest of Tokyo were suspended. The massive Tokyo Metropolitan Government Building, designed by architect Kenzo Tange and completed in 1991 at a cost of nearly 157 billion yen, was supposed to transform Shinjuku into a modern business hub. Its twin towers, reaching 48 stories into the sky, were the tallest buildings in Tokyo at the time. But the bubble burst the same year it opened. The gleaming towers overlooked a district that was struggling to find its footing. And yet Kabukicho remained Kabukicho. It was not beautiful in any conventional sense. It was not safe in the way that most of Tokyo was safe. But it was alive, relentlessly alive, a place where the rules that governed the rest of the city loosened their grip. Perhaps every city needs such a place. A release valve. A reminder that civilization is thinner than we like to pretend. Odaiba, an artificial island in Tokyo Bay, represented a different kind of transformation. The land had been built during the bubble years for a massive telecommunications and business center. When the bubble burst, the development stalled. For years, Odaiba was an empty expanse of reclaimed land, connected to the city by a rainbow-colored bridge, but populated by almost no one. Gradually, the empty spaces filled with what developers could sell in a depressed economy: entertainment, shopping malls, theme parks, museums, arcades. Odaiba became Tokyo's playground, a place to escape the crowded neighborhoods of the mainland for wide boulevards and harbor views. It was never what its original planners intended, but it became something. And that something was enough. Now let us return to those who lost the most during these years, because their stories deserve to be remembered. There was the typical scenario that journalists documented again and again. A Tokyo bureaucrat who purchased a modest apartment at the peak for about $400,000. The apartment had 4 small rooms, nothing luxurious by international standards. But it was his. 20 years later, the apartment was worth less than half what he had paid, while the original debt remained largely unpaid. In hindsight, he said, the 70 million yen price tag seems absurd. But how were you to know? Condos that sold for $500,000 in 1990 were worth only $145,000 by 2001, and yet the mortgages remained patient and immovable, waiting to be paid over 30 or 40 years. The lost generation, as they came to be called, suffered in ways that were less visible but no less real. An estimated 17 to 20 million people who graduated during the employment ice age never recovered their footing. They moved from part-time job to part-time job. They lived with their parents into their 30s, their 40s, their 50s. They never married, never had children, never accumulated the savings that their parents had assumed would be automatic. By 2020, an estimated 613,000 middle-aged Japanese had become hikikomori, people who had withdrawn completely from society, living in their childhood bedrooms, avoiding all human contact. Many of these cases were directly linked to the trauma of failed employment during the Ice Age years. A rejection letter at age 22 had led to paralysis at age 50. The phenomenon acquired a name: the 8050 problem. This referred to the 80-year-old parents still supporting 50-year-old children who had never launched into independent lives. What would happen, social workers asked, when those parents died? What would happen to an entire generation that had been abandoned by an economy that promised them everything and delivered almost nothing? There were darker consequences still. Multiple violent crimes in recent years have been linked to disaffected members of the Ice Age generation, people who felt they had been cheated of the lives they deserved, people whose bitterness had curdled over decades into something dangerous. The Kawasaki knife attack of 2019 was perpetrated by a man who had lived as a hikikomori, dependent on elderly relatives who had recently died. But most of the Ice Age generation were not dangerous. Most of them were simply tired. They had done what they were told, studied hard, played by the rules. And the rules had changed without warning, leaving them stranded. There is a woman I want to tell you about, though her story requires some speculation where the facts are unclear. Her name was Nui Onui, and in the late 1980s she was one of the largest individual investors in Japan. She had started as a waitress, then opened a restaurant in Osaka. Somewhere along the way she began to invest, and she was remarkably successful. By 1987, she had borrowed between $2 and $3 billion to speculate in the stock market. She became the largest individual stockholder in the Industrial Bank of Japan. What made her unusual beyond the scale of her investments was her method. She reportedly received investment advice through seances, during which she claimed to commune with spirits of the dead. Whether she genuinely believed in these communications, or whether they were merely a technique for making decisions in an uncertain world, I cannot say. When the bubble burst, Onue lost everything. She went bankrupt in 1991, owing approximately $3 billion. She was eventually convicted of fraud and spent years in prison. Her story is sometimes told as comedy, the superstitious woman who gambled on ghosts, but I think there is something more to it. In an era when everyone was gambling on rising prices, when the entire economy was based on the assumption that land and stocks would only go up, was her method really so different from anyone else's? She simply named her irrationality, while others pretended their irrationality was reason. The literature and film of the era captured the mood in ways that economic statistics never could. Haruki Murakami, already famous before the crash, wrote novels that spoke to the dislocation and loneliness of contemporary Japan. His characters drifted through cities that felt both familiar and strange, searching for meaning in a world where traditional certainties had dissolved. Norwegian Wood, published in 1987, became one of the best-selling novels in Japanese history, its melancholy perfectly suited to the times. Banana Yoshimoto, a young writer who emerged just as the bubble was bursting, offered a different kind of response. Her novels were small and intimate, focused on grief and healing, on the quiet ways people reconstruct their lives after loss. Kitchen, her debut, was published in 1988 and found readers who were hungry for stories about surviving rather than succeeding. The music scene reflected the era's contradictions. J-pop became a massive commercial force, its manufactured idols offering cheerful escapism. Groups like SMAP dominated television and advertising, their smiling faces everywhere. But alongside the mainstream, darker currents flowed. Visual K-bands dressed in elaborate costumes that challenged gender norms, their makeup and clothing borrowing from glam rock, goth, and kabuki theater. Ex-Japan, founded in 1982 but reaching their peak in the early 90s, combined metal with classical influences and created a devoted following. Their guitarist Hide, whose real name was Hideto Matsumoto, became an icon of the scene. When he died in 1998 at age 33, over 50,000 mourners attended his funeral. Some fans took their own lives in the aftermath. The underground club scene in Tokyo also flourished during these years. In neighborhoods like Shimokitazawa and Kainji, live houses and small venues hosted bands that would never appear on television. The economics worked differently here. Low rents meant that marginally profitable venues could survive. Young musicians who might have become salarymen in an earlier era found ways to pursue their art. Electronic music found a home in Tokyo's clubs. Yellow, Maniac Love, and other venues hosted DJs from around the world and cultivated local talent. The city that had invented karaoke now became a destination for techno tourists. The sound systems were precise, the crowds were devoted, and the parties lasted until the first train started running at 5 in the morning. Film struggled during these years, its budgets constrained by economic reality. But some directors found ways to work within the limitations. Takeshi Kitano, already famous as a television comedian, reinvented himself as a filmmaker with Sonatine in 1993 and Hanabi in 1997. His films were violent and contemplative, featuring Yakuza characters who faced death with a kind of weary acceptance. Hirokazu Koreeda emerged as a master of family dramas that captured the texture of daily life. His films were quiet, observational, attentive to the small moments that define relationships. In a culture recovering from excess, his restraint felt like wisdom. The anime industry, beyond the landmark works like Evangelion that we have already discussed, produced a steady stream of innovation. Studio Ghibli, under the direction of Hayao Miyazaki and Isao Takahata, created films that found audiences worldwide. Princess Mononoke in 1997 became the highest-grossing film in Japanese history at that time. Its environmental themes and moral complexity offered something far beyond typical animation. Satoshi Kon, who died tragically young in 2010, made his directorial debut with Perfect Blue in 1997. The film explored the collapse of identity in a media-saturated world, its thriller plot masking deeper anxieties about performance and authenticity. It would influence filmmakers from Darren Aronofsky to Christopher Nolan. Let us also visit Asakusa, a neighborhood that offered a different kind of response to the lost decade. While Shibuya looked to the future and Ginza reinvented itself for luxury, Asakusa held on to the past. The Sensoji Temple, Tokyo's oldest, continued to draw millions of visitors each year. The shopping street leading to its gates sold the same traditional snacks and souvenirs that it had sold for generations. The old entertainment district around Asakusa had declined long before the bubble, replaced by the flashier attractions of Shinjuku and Shibuya. But there was something comforting about a neighborhood that did not need to change. The temples and shrines remained. The festivals continued on schedule. Old women sold rice crackers from shops their grandmothers had owned. During the lost decade, some young people began returning to these traditional neighborhoods, finding in their unhurried pace an alternative to the anxiety of the present. They opened cafes in old buildings, galleries in former warehouses. They learned traditional crafts from aging masters. It was not a mass movement, but it was real. Yanaka, another old neighborhood in the northeast of Tokyo, became known for its cats and its cemeteries, its narrow streets, and its resistance to modernization. Artists and writers settled there. Small businesses that made no sense by bubble-era economics somehow survived. The neighborhood proved that there were other ways to measure value. The years after the bubble saw slow, painful attempts at recovery. The government tried stimulus packages, infrastructure spending, interest rate cuts. The Bank of Japan eventually lowered rates to 0, an unprecedented measure. Nothing seemed to work. In 2001, Junichiro Koizumi became prime minister on a platform of structural reform. He promised to destroy the Liberal Democratic Party in order to save it, to break up the cozy relationships between government, banks and corporations that had allowed the bubble to form and its aftermath to fester. His reforms were real but limited. The economy remained stuck. In 2001, Junichiro Koizumi became prime minister on a platform of structural reform. He promised to destroy the Liberal Democratic Party in order to save it, to break up the cozy relationships between government, banks and corporations that had allowed the bubble to form and its aftermath to fester. His reforms were real but limited. The economy remained stuck. Koizumi was an unusual politician by Japanese standards. He wore his hair long, listened to heavy metal music, and spoke in ways that seemed to bypass the careful vagueness of typical political discourse. He became genuinely popular, a celebrity politician in an era that had grown distrustful of politics. But even his energy could not quickly heal wounds that had been decades in the making. The banking system, finally forced to acknowledge its losses, underwent painful consolidation. Great names in Japanese finance merged or disappeared entirely. Mitsubishi and UFJ combined. Sumitomo and Mitsui joined forces. The confident independence of the bubble years gave way to defensive alliances as weakened institutions sought strength in size. Women's lives changed in complex ways during the lost decade. The traditional path of office lady to housewife became harder to follow when there were fewer stable salarymen to marry. But this disruption also created opportunities. Women stayed in the workforce longer. Some rose to positions that would have been unthinkable a generation earlier. The popularity of so-called trendy dramas on television, romantic series featuring beautiful young professionals, offered a vision of urban femininity that was independent and fashionable. The characters had careers, apartments, romantic complications. They were not waiting to be saved by marriage. Whether television reflected reality or shaped it, something was changing. Divorce became more common and less shameful. Women who might have endured unhappy marriages in earlier generations now had alternatives. The economic crisis had destroyed the security that marriage was supposed to provide, so what exactly was being sacrificed? Some women discovered that they could support themselves, that independence was possible, that loneliness was preferable to dependence on the wrong partner. The host club phenomenon, in which women paid handsomely for the attention of attractive young men, can be understood partly in this context. Women who had their own money, who worked demanding jobs, who were not dependent on husbands or fathers, could choose how to spend their time and their yen. Some of them chose attention, flattery, escape. The transaction was more honest, in its way, than many marriages. The young women who became Gyaru, who transformed themselves into walking advertisements for resistance, were also making choices. They rejected the expectations of their mothers and grandmothers. They created identities that made no sense by traditional standards. They were criticized, dismissed, warned of the consequences, and they persisted, because the old rules no longer seemed to apply to their lives. By the mid-2000s, some of the innovations born from crisis had become established industries. The anime and manga export business generated billions of dollars in revenue. Japanese fashion designers showed collections in Paris and New York. Video games from Tokyo studios sold tens of millions of copies worldwide. The creative economy that had flourished in the margins was now a significant contributor to national income. The government began to recognize this shift. In 2002, the Prime Minister's office established the Cool Japan initiative, an effort to promote Japanese pop culture abroad. What had begun as youth rebellion and fan obsession was now official policy. The otaku, who had been mocked in the 1980s, were now economic contributors. But the damage of the lost decade was not easily repaired. The demographic trends that the crisis had accelerated continued their trajectory. Birth rates remained stubbornly low. The population began to shrink, for the first time in modern Japanese history. Empty houses appeared in rural areas, then in the suburbs, then in parts of Tokyo itself. Schools closed for lack of students. Entire villages were abandoned. The Ice Age generation remained trapped in a limbo that showed no signs of ending. Now in their 40s and 50s, they faced old age without the savings, the family connections, or the social safety net that their parents had taken for granted. Social welfare systems designed for a different era struggled to accommodate their needs. The 2008 global financial crisis hit Japan hard, even though Japanese banks had not participated in the subprime lending that caused the collapse elsewhere. The vending machines of Tokyo deserve their own moment of attention, because they reveal something essential about the city's character. There were more than 5 million vending machines in Japan by the mid-90s, selling everything imaginable. Hot coffee and cold tea, cigarettes and beer, rice and batteries and umbrellas, fresh eggs and cut flowers and underwear. The machines operated around the clock, in every neighborhood, on every corner. They glowed in the darkness of residential streets, offering their small comforts to anyone with the right coins. A salaryman walking home from the last train could buy a can of hot corn soup to warm his hands. A student studying through the night could get an energy drink without speaking to another human. The machines asked no questions and made no judgments. There was something both convenient and melancholy about this. The loneliness of a city where machines had replaced human interaction for many daily transactions, but also the kindness of a city that made sure you could always find what you needed, even at 3 in the morning, even when no shops were open, even when you wanted no company but your own. The love hotel industry, which had boomed during the bubble years, adapted to leaner times. These establishments, designed for couples seeking privacy that cramped apartments could not provide, dotted the streets near entertainment districts. Their facades were often fantastical, designed to attract attention from the street while hiding the identities of those who entered. Inside, the rooms offered themes and amenities that ranged from the merely comfortable to the elaborately strange. Rates were charged by the hour for rest, or by the night for stay. Married couples used them for rare privacy away from children and in-laws. Unmarried couples used them because there was nowhere else to go. The industry was huge, generating billions of yen annually, and it continued through the lost decade because the human need for intimacy did not diminish when stock prices fell. The sento, or public bathhouse, was another institution that revealed the texture of daily life. In older neighborhoods, where apartment buildings lacked private bathing facilities, the sento served both practical and social functions. Neighbors who might never speak on the street would sit together in the hot water, their bodies exposed, their conversation flowing more freely than it might elsewhere. Many sento closed during the lost decade, unable to compete with new apartment buildings that included unit baths, but some survived, cherished by loyal customers who valued the ritual, the community, the simple luxury of a large tub that one did not have to clean oneself. On winter evenings, the steam rising from sento chimneys marked neighborhoods where the old ways persisted. The Shotengai, traditional shopping streets, also faced challenges. These were the neighborhood commercial districts, lined with small shops selling vegetables and fish, hardware and clothing, everyday necessities at human scale. Supermarkets and convenience stores offered cheaper prices and longer hours. Department stores offered glamour and selection. What could the Shotengai provide that these competitors could not? Some died. Their shops closed one by one, their arcades grew empty, their foot traffic dwindled to nothing. But others adapted, becoming destinations for those seeking what chains could not offer. A fishmonger who knew your name and your preferences, a baker whose bread was fresh each morning, a hardware store where the elderly proprietor could solve any household problem. In an era of standardization, particularity became valuable. The rhythm of the Tokyo day had its own patterns that economic conditions could not entirely disrupt. The morning rush, beginning before 6, when the city surged toward its center. The lunch hour, when office workers spilled onto the streets searching for affordable meals. The after-work migration to izakayas and karaoke boxes and trains heading home. The late-night emptiness, when only taxis and delivery trucks moved through streets that had been crowded hours before. Each season brought its rituals. Cherry blossom viewing in spring, when the parks filled with picnickers sitting on blue tarps, eating bento lunches, drinking sake and beer, celebrating the brief beauty of the flowers. The summer fireworks festivals, when crowds gathered along rivers to watch explosions of color fill the sky. The autumn moon viewing, more contemplative, when the full moon was honored with offerings of rice dumplings. The year-end rituals of cleaning and preparation, the temple bells ringing 108 times at midnight on New Year's Eve, one ring for each of the Buddhist afflictions. These rhythms continued through the lost decade. Whatever the Nikkei did, the cherry blossoms bloomed in April. Whatever the unemployment rate, the fireworks still painted the summer sky. The human need for beauty and celebration and shared experience could not be eliminated by economic crisis. If anything, these moments became more precious when so much else had been lost. The country's export-dependent economy contracted sharply as global demand disappeared. Just as signs of recovery had been appearing, they vanished again. Factories that had begun rehiring stopped once more. Export orders that had been growing suddenly collapsed. The crisis that began with American mortgages rippled across the Pacific, striking an economy that had never fully healed from its own collapse 2 decades earlier. Toyota, the mighty automaker that had symbolized Japanese manufacturing excellence, reported its first operating loss in 70 years. Sony, which had seemed invincible when it bought Columbia Pictures, now struggled to compete with Samsung and Apple. The champions of the bubble era found themselves fighting for survival in a world that had moved on. But there was something different about how Japan experienced this crisis compared to the one that had begun in 1990. The expectations were lower. The illusions had already been shattered. Nobody believed anymore that prices only went up, that jobs were guaranteed, that the future would be brighter than the past. The pain was real, but it was not accompanied by the psychological devastation of the first collapse. Perhaps this was wisdom. Perhaps it was merely exhaustion. But the Japanese response to the 2008 crisis was steadier, less panicked, more resigned than it had been in the early 90s. The country knew how to suffer now. It had been suffering for a long time. In 2011, a different kind of disaster struck. The earthquake and tsunami that devastated northeastern Japan on March 11th killed nearly 20,000 people and triggered a nuclear crisis at the Fukushima Daiichi power plant. For a time, the economic concerns that had dominated the lost decade seemed almost trivial. This was loss that could not be measured in yen. The response to the disaster revealed something about what Japan had become during the decades of economic struggle. There was no looting, no chaos, no breakdown of social order. People waited patiently in lines for water and food. They helped their neighbors, shared what little they had, faced unimaginable loss with dignity that the world watched in amazement. Some observers called this stoicism, as if it were a cultural characteristic that existed independent of circumstance. But I think it was also practice. A nation that had spent 2 decades adjusting to disappointment, lowering expectations, finding meaning in small things rather than grand ambitions, was perhaps better prepared to face catastrophe, not unaffected by it, but able to continue through it. In 2012, Shinzo Abe returned to power with a new economic program that would be called Abenomics. It combined monetary stimulus, fiscal spending, and structural reforms in a renewed attempt to break Japan out of its deflationary spiral. The yen weakened, making exports more competitive. Stock prices rose. There were genuine signs of improvement. But the deeper wounds did not heal quickly. The Ice Age generation remained frozen. The demographic decline continued. The birth rate fell to levels that made long-term population stability impossible. Young people, uncertain about the future, continued to delay marriage and childbearing. And now we come to the ending of this story, though of course it is not really an ending at all. On February 22nd, 2024, the Nikkei stock index closed above 39,000 for the first time since December 1989. 34 years. It had taken 34 years for Japan's stock market to recover the ground it lost in a single year. I find myself uncertain what to make of this. Is it a triumph? A vindication? Evidence that if you wait long enough, even the deepest wounds heal? Perhaps. But I think the people who lived through those years would offer a more complicated answer. What was lost during the lost decade was not just money, though the money losses were staggering. It was something harder to measure, a kind of certainty about the future, an agreement between generations that hard work would be rewarded, that the path was clear, that Japan's rise would continue indefinitely. What was found, unexpectedly, was something else. A culture that could laugh at itself through anime and manga. A creative industry that conquered the world. Young people who invented new ways of being beautiful when the old ways no longer made sense. Small businesses that valued craft over scale. A quieter appreciation for the pleasures that did not cost money. Tokyo today is not the Tokyo of 1980. The excess is gone, and with it, a certain kind of excitement. But there is something gentler in its place. A city that has learned, painfully, that there are limits, that prices can fall as well as rise, that the morning after the party must be faced. When you walk through Shibuya now, you will still see young people dressed in ways that would have scandalized their grandparents. When you ride the trains at rush hour, you will still be pressed against strangers in intimate discomfort. When you visit a konbini at midnight, you will still find the rice balls perfectly wrapped, the coffee perfectly hot, the fluorescent light perfectly indifferent to your troubles. Life continues. That is the story, finally. Not the bubble, not the crash, but the continuation. The human capacity to absorb disaster and keep moving. To find meaning in small pleasures when large dreams have failed. To raise children, to care for parents, to show up for work each morning even when work no longer offers what it once promised. I think there is comfort in this, though it is not an easy comfort. The market recovered after 34 years, but the people who lost their jobs in 1998, who watched their savings evaporate, who spent decades in part-time work or no work at all, they did not get those years back. The recovery, when it came too late for them. And yet, the city is still beautiful. The trains still run on time. The cherry blossoms still bloom each spring along the Meguro River, and people still gather beneath them with blue tarps and bento boxes and bottles of sake, celebrating Hanami as their ancestors did, as their descendants will. There is a Japanese concept called mono no aware, which is sometimes translated as the pathos of things or the sadness of things. It refers to a gentle awareness of impermanence, a bittersweet recognition that all things pass. The cherry blossoms are beautiful precisely because they fall. The moment is precious precisely because it will not last. Perhaps this is what the lost decade taught Tokyo, if a city can be said to learn. That bubbles burst, that prices fall, that the future we imagine is never quite the future we receive, and that somehow, despite everything, life continues. It is late now, dear friends. The neon lights of Shinjuku are flickering in the rain. The last trains are carrying the last salarymen home to their small apartments and their patient families. Tomorrow there will be work, or the search for work, or the quiet despair of those for whom work will never come. But tonight, for now, there is rest. Close your eyes and let the city fade. The bubble has burst and reformed and burst again, as bubbles do. The streets have changed and will change again. But somewhere in Tokyo, at this very moment, someone is standing at a konbini counter, paying for a rice ball and a can of hot coffee, preparing for another day. That is the story. That is always the story. If you enjoyed this journey through Tokyo's lost decade, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps us continue bringing you these late-night histories. Leave a comment letting me know where you are watching from and perhaps what era or city you would like to explore together next. Until then, sleep well, dream gently, and remember that even after the longest night, morning comes. Good night, dear friends.